on the protection and security of small states, notably stressing the vital importance of principles such as sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Mr. President, as a small state, the Maldives relies on international law, the UN Charter, and the strength of our multilateral system to protect us. As we observe the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the Maldives calls on the international community to take action to uphold the universal human rights of Ukrainian citizens. Thus, we encourage all parties to engage in enhanced diplomatic efforts, exercise restraint and caution, and take constructive steps to de-escalate tensions and seek to resolve the current situation expeditiously and peacefully. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Singapur.
Mr. President, Singapore has always taken a consistent and principled position in support of the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. All states, big or small, must observe international law and the principles of the UN Charter. For a small state like Singapore, this is an existential issue. Accordingly, we've always condemned in the strongest terms possible any unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country under any pretext. The Russian Federation's military operations against Ukraine are in breach of international law. This unprovoked attack is a clear contravention of the principles of the UN Charter that heightens the risk of serious human rights violations. We, like many others, are alarmed by reports of civilian casualties, displacement, and destruction of civilian infrastructure. No effort should be spared to protect the civilian population in Ukraine and to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. We strongly call upon Russia to immediately cease its military attacks against Ukraine, withdraw its forces, and return to diplomacy to seek a peaceful settlement in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. Given the unprecedented gravity of the situation, Singapore has decided to co-sponsor the resolution Ukraine has tabled on itself. This is not about taking a side, but about taking a stand. This stand underlines Singapore's clear support as a small state for the clear principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Andorra.
Gracias, señor presidente. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, la principauté d'Andorre condamne fermement l'attaque de la Fédération de Russie contre l'Ukraine. Dans ce sens, nous appelons toutes les parties à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et nous saluons avec espoir la décision de la Fédération de Russie et de l'Ukraine de continuer le dialogue. Il est de notre devoir et de notre responsabilité commune de prévenir les souffrances des populations civiles et nous saluons tous les efforts effectués en ce sens. Nous appelons également au plein respect du droit international humanitaire, respect indispensable dans ces circonstances, notamment pour protéger les populations civiles. L'Andorre souligne l'importance de s'engager vers un dialogue constructif et d'utiliser pleinement les voies diplomatiques et les mécanismes internationaux pour parvenir à une solution pacifique, politique et durable. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Trinidad y Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. President. Trinidad and Tobago aligns with the joint statement of the CARICOM Group. We also emphasize the importance of this urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression. Mr. President, we underscore the strength of our commitment to the territorial integrity of sovereign states and our respect for international law. As such, Trinidad and Tobago roundly rejects the flagrant disregard for these principles, evidenced by the egregious attacks of the Russian Federations that are the subject of our debate this afternoon. On the situation of human rights in Ukraine, this delegation strongly condemns the violence perpetrated against the people of Ukraine. We are deeply concerned about the military aggression that continues to cause unacceptable casualties, injury, destruction, disruption, and displacement, undermining the human rights and security of the people of Ukraine. In the circumstances, Trinidad and Tobago calls for the cessation of hostilities. We urge the aggressors to immediately discontinue their military actions and unconditionally withdraw their military presence. Trinidad and Tobago also underscores the primacy of diplomacy and dialogue as the only acceptable way forward. As such, Trinidad and Tobago urgently calls for good faith engagement and intensified diplomatic dialogue with the aim of de-escalating the conflict and securing a peaceful resolution. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Grecia.
President, Greece fully allies itself with the EU statement. Greece strongly condemns Russia's unprovoked attack against Ukraine. This is an attack against a free, democratic, and peaceful country. It strikes at the very core principles of the UN Charter. It challenges the inviolability of borders and state sovereignty and constitutes a serious threat to the rules-based international order. Revisionism in international law is a threat to world peace and cannot be tolerated. Mr. President, we stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. All violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law must cease. Attacks on civilians in Ukraine must stop immediately. The centuries-old Greek community in Ukraine, numbering around 100,000, mainly in the Mariupol area, is already mourning victims. The brutal Russian attack against civilians in the towns of Sartan and Bugas has resulted in the death of 10 of its members, leaving many injured, including children. The Russian aggression demands a unified response commensurate with its gravity. Yesterday, the international community sent a strong message by overwhelmingly supporting the General Assembly resolution. Now it is up to this Council to act decisively and move towards accountability by establishing a commission of inquiry. Mr. President, it is up to us to show leadership for Ukraine, for Ukrainians, for our values, and for peace. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Belarus.
Благодарю вас, уважаемый господин председатель. Наш Совет, к сожалению, давно стал заложником политической системы Запада, чьи правительства недолговечны и заботятся лишь о том, как завоевать сердца избирателей. Следуя этому, они превращают серьезную политику в балаган с театральными выходами из зала, как из песочницы. Легче всего, следуя чувствам, заявить на камеру «нет войне». Намного сложнее предотвратить или остановить войну. Для этого нужно мыслить другими категориями, нежели эмоции. Нужно мыслить ответственно и стратегически. Безответственность и краткосрочность интересов западной политической элиты привела нас сегодня в этот зал. Эти дебаты не имеют ничего общего с рассматриваемой темой и служат одной задаче – изобразить бурную деятельность и спрятать от мира безответственность и настоящие цели Запада. Ведь с 2014 года как западные страны, так и сам Киев ничего не сделали для действительной защиты в Украине главного права среди прав человека, а именно права на жизнь. Тысячи смертей гражданских жителей за последние 8 лет тому подтверждение. Легче всего бороться за права человека в Украине, сидя в Женеве или Брюсселе, при этом направляя в Украину летальное оружие наемников и молчаливо кивая на заявки на возвращение Киеву ядерного оружия. Шокирует почти мертвое молчание стран Запада в поддержку мирных переговоров, которые сегодня, непосредственно сейчас, проходят в Беларуси. Эти дебаты бессмысленны и только добавляют масла в огонь конфликта Украины. Спасибо.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Albania.
Mr. President, yesterday at the UN General Assembly, an overwhelming majority of UN member states issued a resounding condemnation of Russia's premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified attack on the people of Ukraine. Today, it falls to the UN Human Rights Council to act, to face the horrific human suffering in Ukraine caused by Russia's unconscionable war, and to stand up for the principles and values of the UN and of this Human Rights Council. The situation in Ukraine grows graver by the hour. Russia's violence must stop. The last 8 days have witnessed a tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, one of indiscriminate attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects, of rising death tolls and of millions of people's lives upended. A human rights and humanitarian catastrophe of Russia's making, with Belarus's support. Those responsible must be held to account. The resolution before the Human Rights Council is an important step in protecting the lives, dignity, and fundamental rights of the people affected by Russia's illegal aggression against Ukraine. Albania is one of the co-sponsors of the resolution, and we urge all states to support it. Albania is also one of a group of countries that have decided to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, because we owe it to the victims of Russia's aggression, the people of Ukraine, and the international order that has served the people of the world since the founding of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de la República Árabe Siria.
إن اطلاع هذا المجلس بدوره في تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان ينبغي أن يستند إلى التعاون والحوار، وأن يلتزم بمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية بعيدا عن المعايير المزدوجة والتسييس. وفدي يعتبر أن المسارعة لعقد جلسة النقاش العاجل حول أوكرانيا بعد سنوات من الصمت عن انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان التي تعرض لها سكان منطقة دونباس، والصمت عن إدانة القصف الأوكراني الذي استهدف الأحياء السكنية وأوقع ضحايا بين المدنيين ودفع بالآلاف إلى النزوح نحو الأراضي الروسية، لا ينطلق من مشاغل ذات صلة بحقوق الإنسان، بل من مصالح وأجندات سياسية تسعى لتصعيد الوضع وممارسة الضغط السياسي على الاتحاد الروسي. إن اللجوء إلى فرض تدابير قسرية أحادية غير قانونية بحق روسيا وتجاهل مشاغلها الأمنية المشروعة وإرسال الأسلحة الفتاكة والصواريخ إلى أوكرانيا دون ضوابط يؤكد رغبة الدول الغربية بتصعيد الأزمة وتوفير الغطاء للاستمرار في تهديد الأمن القومي الروسي. لذلك فإن سوريا لا ترى في هذه الجلسة وفي مشروع القرار المسيس المعروض عليها أساسا صالحا لمعالجة مشاغل حقوق الإنسان في أوكرانيا بشكل شامل ومنصف، وتحث الدول الأعضاء على وقف هذا النهج المسيس الذي يتناقض مع دور المجلس ومسؤوليته عن المساهمة في إيجاد تسوية سلمية للأزمات. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Latvia.
We witness the gravest security challenge and international human rights crisis that Europe has experienced since the Second World War. Barbarian military aggression carried out by the Russian Federation have put at risk lives of millions of people in Ukraine. Residential areas, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, and other critical civilian infrastructure are damaged and destroyed by Russian bombing. Innocent civilians, including children, are killed. Over 1 million people have already fled Ukraine. We share the view any person feeling the Russians' unjustified aggression in Ukraine should be received by the dignity and respect, irrespective of their nationality and origins, and with all protectionist assistance. By its illegal military aggression, Russia is grossly violating the United Nations Chapter in International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Today's urgent debate demonstrates the Council's ability to fulfill its purpose and react promptly. We urge the Human Rights Council to adopt a strong resolution. We strongly support the establishment of independent commission of inquiry. Russia's human rights abuse against Ukrainian people should be listed and recorded. All human rights violations must be investigated and those responsible must be held accountable. Thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Chipre.
Cyprus aligns itself with the statement of the European Union unequivocally condemning the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Russia's aggression constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter. Cyprus supports the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine and opposes any acts of secession and annexation. Cyprus, itself a victim of foreign invasion and ongoing occupation stands in solidarity with the brave people of Ukraine and its democratically elected institutions and representatives. We support the resolution before us that seeks to establish a commission of inquiry and wish to see the Human Rights Council play a pivotal role in addressing the grave violations of human rights we are witnessing and in upholding accountability. We deplore the high number of killings, including civilians. We're also gravely concerned about the humanitarian consequences, as over 1 million of people, mostly women and girls, have been compelled to seek refuge to neighboring countries or have become internally displaced. It is essential that unimpeded humanitarian access and aid to all those in need of it is facilitated. We ask the Russian Federation to end hostilities, to withdraw from Ukraine, and to reverse its unlawful acts. We need an immediate return to diplomacy, which will allow for a lasting peace, the end of human suffering, and the full restoration of the human rights of the Ukrainian people. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Georgia.
A week ago, Russia unleashed a devastating, full-scale military aggression against Ukraine, leading to death, destruction, and humanitarian disaster. Fundamental human rights of Ukrainians, first and foremost, the right to life, are being massively violated, and forced displacement is on surge. Russia's indiscriminate military attacks against Ukraine, attacks on civilian infrastructure, including kindergartens, is an assault at the key principles of the UN Charter, Helsinki Final Act, and the Paris Charter. We condemn all these actions in strongest possible terms and believe that the perpetrator of these horrendous violations has no place in this Council. We stress the need for accountability and echo the urgency to initiate prompt, independent, and impartial investigation into all alleged abuses and violations. As co-sponsors of the subsequent Council resolution, we strongly support the establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry in this regard. We also look forward to forthcoming processes in ICJ and ICC. We call on the Russian Federation to immediately and without any preconditions cease military activities and withdraw all forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Allow immediate, safe, and unfettered access to all international humanitarian and human rights mechanisms. Immediately reverse the decision related to the status of integral parts of Ukraine. In conclusion, we reiterate unwavering support to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and navigational rights in its territorial waters. Thank you.
Gracias. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Ireland. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, this Council must act on the violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law being perpetrated across Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Ireland reaffirms our solidarity with the people of Ukraine and our unequivocal condemnation of Russia's shameful military invasion. It is a clear attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and on the principles of the UN Charter. Russia must be held to account for its actions. We have to respond to the devastating scenes of the past week. The killing and maiming of civilians through the heavy use of explosive weapons in populated areas, the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, kindergartens and basic infrastructure, the forcing of over 2 million people from their homes, displacement which will inevitably put women and girls at particular risk. Yesterday, Ireland joined a group of concerned states in referring the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. This Council too must act urgently to ensure accountability at the highest levels. Ireland fully supports the establishment of a commission of inquiry and urges all states to support today's resolution. We salute the bravery and determination of the Ukrainian people and those in Russia raising their voices for peace. It is vital the international community stands united against Russian aggression. Russia must listen to the truth and immediately withdraw from Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Tailandia.
Mr. President, Thailand is gravely troubled by the humanitarian consequence of the hostility, violence, and destruction of infrastructure in Ukraine. The casualties the plight of civilians fleeing the fighting, the disruption of the social fabric, and dislocation of innocent citizens and their families, particularly children, women, and the vulnerables migrating into the neighboring countries, deserve the world's urgent attention. In this regard, we commend Ukraine, neighboring countries, and other states for their prompt actions in mobilizing assistance to those in need, and urge all parties to ensure that they have access to the humanitarian support. On our part, Thailand shall do our utmost in addressing the pressing humanitarian needs of the affected citizens, directly and in partnership with like-minded international organizations. Equally important is our strong wish to see an immediate armistice of the fighting, and our strong commitment in support of the continuation of political dialogue that would lead to the cessation of all combat in Ukraine, and eventually a sustainable peaceful resolution to the conflicts. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Malta.
Thank you. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and in its condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, a gross violation of international law and UN Charter, and the active involvement of Belarus. We join calls on Russia to immediately cease all hostilities, withdraw all its military from Ukraine to their bases within its borders, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. We deeply regret the loss of life and reiterate the Secretary General and High Commissioner Bachelet's concern about violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Refugees and other displaced people need humanitarian assistance, and we need to act rapidly to support them and the receiving countries. Violations to the territorial integrity of states and to international law have global ramifications and only lead to suffering and death of innocent civilians and destruction of civilian homes and infrastructure. Malta reiterates that diplomacy and dialogue must prevail, and we expect that international law, internationally recognized borders, and international humanitarian law are respected and fully recognized in any negotiated outcome. Finally, we join EU member states in expressing our full support and solidarity with the government and people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Gracias.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse condamne avec la plus grande fermeté l'attaque militaire de la Fédération de Russie contre l'Ukraine. Nous réitérons notre appel à la Fédération de Russie à cesser immédiatement les hostilités en se retirant de l'Ukraine. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par les allégations étayées d'utilisation d'armes à sous-munitions qui frappent sans discrimination dans des régions urbaines. La protection de la population civile ainsi que des personnes hors de combat doit être la priorité. Les biens de caractère civil, y compris les biens indispensables à la survie de la population civile, de même que les infrastructures civiles et médicales, doivent être respectés et protégés. De plus, nous demandons aux parties d'assurer l'accès humanitaire rapide et sans entrave et de permettre des pauses humanitaires à des fins exclusivement humanitaires. La Suisse soutient la création d'une commission d'enquête qui contribuera à demander des comptes aux responsables de graves violations des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire. Nous soutenons également le renforcement de la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme de l'ONU en Ukraine qui est toujours opérationnelle. La situation actuelle a également de graves répercussions dans la Fédération de Russie elle-même. Nous condamnons les restrictions imposées aux médias ainsi que le blocage des médias sociaux. Il est essentiel que toutes les personnes puissent s'informer et s'exprimer librement et indépendamment. À ce titre, nous condamnons les arrestations arbitraires de milliers de manifestants qui protestent pacifiquement en Russie. Je vous remercie.
Merci, monsieur l'ambassadeur. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Uruguay.
Uruguay reitera su condena a la violación de la soberanía, la integridad territorial y la independencia de Ucrania como consecuencia de la agresión proveniente de las fuerzas militares de la Federación Rusa que constituye una flagrante violación del derecho internacional. En consecuencia, renovamos el llamado a dicha federación a poner fin a las hostilidades, ya que Ucrania forma parte de las Naciones Unidas e incluso de este Consejo, por lo que los principios y propósitos le deben ser aplicados. Participamos de este debate en el Consejo convencidos que constituye un instrumento adecuado que puede contribuir a prevenir una escalada de graves violaciones a los derechos humanos, debiéndose en tal sentido, dada la gravedad del momento, que se utilicen todos los mecanismos a su disposición. Uruguay lamenta profundamente el impacto que posee el conflicto en cuanto a pérdidas de vidas humanas, incluyendo niños. Asimismo, recordamos que las infraestructuras civiles como hospitales y escuelas no pueden ser objeto de ataques de conformidad al derecho internacional humanitario. En base a esto, todas las partes en conflicto tienen la obligación de garantizar que las operaciones militares se planifiquen y conduzcan de un modo tal que los civiles y los bienes de carácter civil queden protegidos, debiéndose adoptar todas las precauciones para evitar muertes y lesiones. Por estas razones, el Uruguay copatrocina el proyecto de resolución introducido por Ucrania. Gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Dinamarca.
Mr. President, Denmark aligns itself with the EU statement. Denmark is deeply alarmed about Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine. We have seen the Ukrainian people bravely stand up against Russia's military machine. Russia must stop its illegal and meaningless war in Ukraine. Russia must agree to an immediate ceasefire, withdraw its troops, and return to the negotiating table. This is not a matter of the West against Russia. This is Russia against the international rule-based system. Russia goes against the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and international law, including human rights, which makes it a matter for every state and a matter of enforcing the international rules which protect us all. We welcome the call by an unprecedented large number of UN experts on Russia to end their aggression against Ukraine and to stop the violations of human rights. We must continue to help Ukraine and the Ukrainian people with everything we can, and this Council must act to ensure accountability for these heinous violations. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Nicaragua.
El GRUN, en nombre del pueblo de Nicaragua, expresa que ante la grave situación de conflicto que se observa en el este europeo, no debe olvidarse que la génesis del mismo se encuentra en la violación de los acuerdos de Minsk, que se ha manifestado en represión y muerte de miles de ciudadanos de los territorios de Donetsk y Lugansk. Estos momentos exigen que los organismos multilaterales propicien soluciones que se basen en el aseguramiento de la paz para aquellos que vienen siendo amenazados con medidas de agresión y amenazas. Todos debemos de desalentar medidas coercitivas o acciones que favorezcan las tensiones. La paz y el entendimiento entre naciones debe ser la constante para la existencia de la humanidad. Los chantajes, sanciones, amenazas y provocaciones solo producen más conflictos. Nicaragua respalda todo esfuerzo que conduzca a la vida, la libertad y la dignidad de la humanidad. Gracias.
Gracias. And now I give the floor to the Republic of Moldova.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Excellencies, we all view this forum with reverence and consider it important to be vocal and speak up against violations of human rights. I don't know what could be said today to make a difference. I wish we did. Republic of Moldova, while being a neutral country, joined the international community in condemning in the most resolute terms the act of war that the Russian Federation has launched against Ukraine. This attack constitutes a blatant breach of international law and a serious violation of the fundamental documents and principles on which Human Rights Council and the entire international order are based. Together with other countries, we are co-sponsoring the resolution tabled by Ukraine and welcome this urgent debate. Again, is it enough to make a difference, to stop the loss and irreversible devastation of lives of so many people? Listening earlier to the reports of the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur, but also seeing all this from the front lines, as Moldova is really in the front line, it is clear that the UN Charter principles and commitments were breached.
In the very beginning, it says that we must save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. We already failed them. Thus, today our plea is to immediately stop all military actions in Ukraine, to observe the rules of humanitarian law, to return to dialogue and diplomacy as the only means for ensuring peace and stability on our continent. We reiterate our full solidarity with Ukraine, its people, and its democratically elected authorities. We reconfirm our unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Nueva Zelanda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine as they continue to fight Russia's large-scale invasion. Innocent lives lost, everyday lives in turmoil. The people of Ukraine are now facing a humanitarian and human rights crisis caused by the conflict. It is therefore appropriate for the Human Rights Council to be addressing this issue through the urgent debate. New Zealand is pleased to co-sponsor the resolution on the situation of human rights in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression and fully supports the establishment of a commission of inquiry complementing and building upon the work of the existing UN human rights monitoring mechanism in Ukraine. New Zealand is in no doubt that the conflict in Ukraine is a direct result of the unprovoked and unjustified actions of Russia. As our Minister of Foreign Affairs stated to this Council on Monday, Aotearoa New Zealand is a proponent of peace and reconciliation, and we condemn, in the strongest possible terms, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We also express serious concern about the human rights abuses and violations occurring within Russia, and we note the role that Belarus has played in support of Russia's invasion. We call on all member states to uphold their obligations under international law and international human rights and humanitarian law. Further, we, the international community, must act now to prevent further pointless loss of innocent life, breaches of fundamental human rights, and to support those who now find themselves displaced through no fault of their own. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Y ahora tiene la palabra la delegación de Chile. El embajador tiene la palabra.
Gracias, señor presidente, señora alta comisionada. En primer lugar, Chile valora la realización de este debate urgente sobre la situación de derechos humanos en Ucrania, pues la gravedad de los hechos requiere de una respuesta rápida y contundente de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos y de la comunidad internacional. Por ello, Chile ha copatrocinado las resoluciones que se han presentado sobre este tema tanto en la Asamblea General como en este Consejo. En este sentido, apoyamos la creación de la Comisión de Investigación que se va a presentar. El gobierno de Chile rechaza enérgicamente la agresión armada de Rusia y la violación a la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania. Condenamos de manera categórica el uso de la fuerza en las relaciones internacionales y reiteramos el llamado al diálogo para encontrar una solución pacífica al conflicto. Consideramos de particular relevancia señalar que Rusia forma parte de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos y como tal se ha comprometido con el respeto a los más altos estándares de protección de los derechos humanos. Es por esto que hacemos un llamado a Rusia para que retire sus tropas, respete la integridad territorial y soberanía de Ucrania y evite la pérdida de más vidas inocentes y daños materiales, respetando los convenios de Ginebra. Para finalizar, manifestamos la solidaridad del pueblo de Chile con los millones de personas en Ucrania afectadas por esta guerra. Chile abriga la esperanza de que prevalezca el diálogo y las negociaciones para prevenir un mayor escalamiento de este conflicto que amenaza la paz y las seguridades internacionales. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Liechtenstein.
Liechtenstein condemns the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine in strongest terms. We stand in solidarity with the government and the people of Ukraine in these tragic circumstances. We are greatly concerned about the rapid escalation of the armed conflict by the Russian armed forces, the shelling of civilian targets, and the use of prohibited weaponry, resulting in large numbers of civilian casualties, as well as multiple rocket launch systems and air strikes in densely populated areas. We urge for the full respect of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We are particularly alarmed about the precarious situation of the civilian population and the humanitarian crisis unfolding as a result of the Russian aggression. the Liechtenstein government has decided to swiftly make a significant first contribution to help address the most urgent humanitarian needs. We underline the need to prevent impunity and ensure accountability for serious violations of international humanitarian law. In this respect, we welcome the statement by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announcing his intention to open an investigation into the situation in Ukraine as rapidly as possible, and have joined other states in referring the situation to the court in order to expedite its urgently needed action. We call on the members of this Council to support the draft resolution on the situation of human rights in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression, which mandates a commission of inquiry to monitor and investigate the situation in Ukraine, which we have co-sponsored. We hope that this Council will thus be able to complement the strong resolution adopted yesterday by the UN General Assembly with overwhelming majority. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Ecuador. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
El Ecuador participa en este debate urgente consternado por la grave situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania, derivada de la agresión militar perpetrada por Rusia, que condenamos por violar la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania. Mi país hace un llamado para el cese inmediato de las hostilidades y el inicio de los diálogos que permitan restaurar la paz. Insta a que se respete plenamente el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los refugiados, y se garantice el acceso de ayuda humanitaria sin restricciones. El conflicto bélico es la negación total de los derechos humanos, una tragedia humanitaria. La población civil en Ucrania requiere urgente protección, particularmente a mujeres, niños y personas en situación de vulnerabilidad, quienes se han convertido en las víctimas de la guerra. Mi país ha puesto en marcha un plan de emergencia para evacuar a más de 800 ciudadanos ecuatorianos residentes en Ucrania y agradece a los países vecinos por el apoyo otorgado al facilitarles el ingreso a sus territorios. La agresión armada contra Ucrania vulnera el derecho internacional y los principios y propósitos de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, la paz, la seguridad, el respeto a la igualdad soberana de los estados, la solución pacífica de controversias. Condenamos la amenaza del uso de armas nucleares y toda amenaza o el uso de la fuerza contra la integridad territorial de los estados. Gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Guatemala. Embajadora, tiene la palabra.
Señor presidente, señora alta comisionada, el gobierno de Guatemala reitera su condena a la flagrante violación por parte de la Federación de Rusia a la Carta de Naciones Unidas y al derecho internacional, incluyendo el de derechos humanos y el humanitario. Nuestra condena ha sido expresada en foros multilaterales, regionales e interregionales, incluyendo el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Urgimos también a una pronta solución pacífica que garantice el respeto a la soberanía, la integridad territorial, los derechos humanos y la paz y seguridad a nivel mundial. La intervención e invasión militar rusa al territorio soberano de Ucrania ha cobrado ya la vida de miles de personas, la destrucción de infraestructura y medios de vida de la población y provocado 1 millón de refugiados. Frente a ello, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos no puede quedar indiferente. Debe pronunciarse enérgicamente. El gobierno de Guatemala ha apoyado la celebración de este debate urgente y copatrocinado la resolución sobre situación de derechos humanos en Ucrania resultantes de la agresión rusa. Confiamos en que este Consejo cumplirá fielmente su mandato de responder con prontitud a las situaciones de emergencia en materia de derechos humanos adoptando esta resolución. Hacemos un llamado a los miembros del Consejo a cumplir con la responsabilidad que asumieron al ser electos de aplicar las normas más estrictas en la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos, así como a cooperar plenamente con el mismo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Israel is a country that has experienced many wars and therefore knows firsthand that war is not the way to resolve conflicts. War sows destruction, chaos, and tragedy, not a brighter future. The Russian attack on Ukraine is a serious violation of international order. We have condemned it and will continue to do so. We call upon Russia to heed the calls of the international community, to stop the attack and respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Mr. President, Israel is concerned over the impact on civilians, including the rising number of civilian fatalities and mass displacement. Reports by UNHCR that over 1 million people have fled the country over the past week is concerning. The human rights of the Ukraine people must be respected and protected. We're also gravely concerned by the growing humanitarian crisis. Israel has provided 100 tons of humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine in these challenging times and is calling upon the parties to facilitate humanitarian access. More aid is to come. Israel has a long-standing and positive relations with both Russia and the Ukraine. Given our deep ties with both sides, we are willing to contribute to the diplomatic efforts if so requested and have been trying to do so in the last couple of weeks. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra el Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm delivering my statement on behalf of the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, Ms. Rahim Steiner. Excellencies, I echo the UN Secretary General in calling for the violence in Ukraine to end. People's lives, their dignity and human rights must be protected, and international human rights law and international humanitarian law must be respected. For 3 decades in Ukraine, UNDP has worked with local communities, helping them to exercise their rights, including in conflict-affected areas. This week, UNDP joined the rest of the UN system under the Flash Appeal to ensure livelihood support, community and social cohesion, and emergency response. UNDP works with government entities, civil society organizations, human rights defenders, and the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the national human rights institutions in Ukraine. To date, we continue to work with these partners to ensure inclusive, sustainable, and rights-based human development. They are at the forefront of the crisis, making a vital contribution to promote and protect human rights and support accountability and justice in Ukraine. In these unprecedented circumstances, UNDP will continue to promote peace building through local development and the promotion of human rights in Ukraine. The UN family will stay and deliver for the people of Ukraine in their hour of need.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra la República Democrática de Corea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The root cause of the Ukrainian crisis totally lies in the hegemonic policy of the United States and the West, which indulge themselves in high-handedness and arbitrariness to other countries. The conflict and ethnic discord between the countries have not ceased, and innocent people are suffering in many parts of the world, resulting from the unfair interference of the United States and Western countries. The peace would never settle on the world at any time, as long as there remains the double-dealing policy, which is threatening the peace and security of sovereign state. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Afganistán. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Afghanistan knows firsthand that when conflict besieges a nation and when a nation is abandoned to force of terror and tyranny, the first to suffer are civilians. To that end, we condemn the war in Ukraine and call for an unconditional respect for human rights and humanitarian law. As the war escalates, the horrific consequences for human life and human rights increases. This has become evident in the recent attacks that hit civilian targets, including hospitals, and caused civilian casualties. Violation of international law must be noted, regardless of the stature of the parties involved. Turning a blind eye to violation in one area of the world is an affront to human rights everywhere. In Afghanistan, the Taliban regime, using diversion of world attention, has intensified its campaign of intimidation and subjugation through illegal and indiscriminatory house-to-house searches in Kabul and mainly northern provinces. Civilian lives, homes, and infrastructure must be protected. Indiscriminate attacks and the use of prohibited weapons such as cluster munition must stop. As a state party to Convention on Cluster Munition, Afghanistan calls for an end to the use of such weapons by all sides that indiscriminately kill civilians. Finally, Mr. President, Afghanistan echoes the call for creation of an investigative mechanism, as well as to call for all parties involved to facilitate immediate access of humanitarian passage to civilians, including hundreds of Afghans who have saved refuge to Ukraine and now they have to find another safety. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Santa Sede.
President. The Holy See continues to follow with grave concern the dramatic unfolding of the conflict in Ukraine. We renew the appeal for a glimmer of conscience on the part of those who hold in their hands the fortunes of the world and ask for the immediate cessation of all hostilities. It is undeniable that all people want peace, which is not merely the absence of conflict, but to live in safety and without fear. This aspiration to peace can never be satisfied by military means alone, much less by the threat or use of weapons of mass destruction. Pope Francis clearly states that those who wage war forget humanity. They do not look at the real life of people, but place partisan interests and power before all else. And they distance themselves from ordinary people who want peace and who are the real victims in every conflict, who pay for the follies of war with their own skin. Let us think of the suffering of mothers fleeing with children, of families being separated. Let us think of the elderly and of the massive displacement and disruption caused by conflicts. In this regard, the Holy See is thankful to the generosity that is being shown to Ukraine by several countries in welcoming refugees and in helping the population. However, there is an urgent need to establish corridors and safe passages. The Holy See wishes to renew the appeal of the Pope to reject war as a means to settle international disputes. It is imperative to return to negotiations before it is too late. Dialogue is still possible, but the longer the procrastination, the greater are the losses, especially of human lives, the harsher the animosity will become, and thus the harder reconciliation efforts will be. Thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Líbano.
السيد الرئيس ينضم لبنان إلى بيان المجموعة العربية ويؤكد وفد بلادي على ما جاء في بيان وزارة الخارجية اللبنانية على أثر اندلاع العمليات العسكرية في
Interpretación, por favor. Un momento, embajador, por favor. No tenemos interpretación. Vuelva a comenzar, por favor, embajador. Gracias.
السيد الرئيس ينضم لبنان إلى بيان المجموعة العربية يؤكد وفد بلادي على ما جاء في بيان وزارة الخارجية اللبنانية على أثر اندلاع العمليات العسكرية في أوكرانيا ويتخوف من تداعيات هذه العمليات على حالة حقوق الإنسان في البلاد فضلا عن ارتداداتها الخطيرة على الأمن والسلم في أوروبا والعالم ناهيك عن أزمة اللجوء والانعكاسات على الأوضاع الاقتصادية العالمية. لقد عانى لبنان وما زال من ويلات الحروب والاعتداءات وبالتالي فهو متمسك بميثاق الأمم المتحدة وبالقانون الدولي ويشجع دائما على احترامهما عوض اللجوء إلى العنف والحروب وعليه يدعو لبنان إلى وقف العمليات العسكرية في أسرع وقت ممكن حقنا للدماء وإفساحا في المجال للحوار لإيجاد حلول مستدامة تضمن سلامة واستقلال أوكرانيا ووحدة أراضيها وسيادتها وتساعد على إزالة هواجس الطرفين. ختاما يشدد لبنان على ضرورة احترام القانون الدولي الإنساني ومعاهدات جنيف ويأمل أن يساهم الحوار الدائر حاليا في مجلسنا الموقر فضلا عن الجهود الدبلوماسية القائمة في محافل أخرى في حلحلة هذه الأزمة الخطيرة وإحلال السلام المنشود. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Tenga palabra la delegación de Timor-Leste.
Mr. President, Timor-Leste welcomes the organization of this urgent debate on the situation of human rights in Ukraine. Timor-Leste is deeply concerned with the current situation in Ukraine, which is resulting in serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. We therefore call on all parties to the conflict to continue and strengthen their diplomatic dialogue and to immediately adopt a ceasefire. Human rights and international humanitarian law shall be respected at all times, especially in times of war. We must not forget that it is up to the states to guarantee the safety of its people, and they must spare no efforts in ensuring that all citizens live in peace and dignity. As a young democracy who came back from the ashes of foreign occupation, Timor-Leste knows firsthand that war brings benefit to no one. It is with a heavy heart that we see the people of Ukraine and of Russia suffering in this war, while in the middle of the global health pandemic. We shall not neglect that governments have committed to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, as it's stated in the UN Charter. Mr. President, Ukraine's independence and sovereignty must be respected. I conclude this statement reiterating Timor-Leste's appeal for peace, dialogue, and an immediate ceasefire. I thank you, Mr. President.
Obrigado. Tiene la palabra Macedonia del Norte.
Mr. President, North Macedonia strongly condemns and renounces the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by armed forces of the Russian Federation. Russia's military attack on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of an independent state represents a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter. It undermines the European security architecture, the global stability, and the universally agreed fundamental rights. The Ukrainian cities are under continuous assaults and siege, causing immense human casualties, including children, women, and elderly. With 1 million of Ukrainians having fled their homeland, the situation in Ukraine threatens to turn into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe and Europe's largest refugee crisis of the century. North Macedonia reiterates its unwavering support and commitment to Ukrainians' independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We call upon Russia to end its military aggression, which endangers international peace and security. We stand firmly with the people of Ukraine and its democratically elected institutions and representatives. My country will continue to aid Ukraine as much as possible, is prepared to receive refugees and provide additional humanitarian assistance. This is a time for us to come together, to stand up for principles, uphold the values that are core to our survival and existence as independent, sovereign nations and as a civilized world. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Sudáfrica.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement of the African Group. South Africa remains concerned about the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. South Africa believes in the peaceful settlement of disputes and that armed conflicts result in unnecessary human suffering and destruction with global ramifications. In situations of conflict, the most vulnerable in particular, women, children, and people with disabilities, bear the brunt of conflict the most. Mr. President, South Africa maintains that peace is best built through diplomacy and dialogue within the framework of multilateral institutions, mainly the United Nations. We encourage all concerned to respect and uphold the principles of international law, including international human rights, humanitarian law, and the provisions of the UN Charter. We reiterate our strong commitment to the peaceful resolution of disputes. In this regard, we also urge the Council and the High Commissioner for Human Rights to support efforts aimed at finding a peaceful, lasting solution to the situation in Ukraine. We call on the UN Secretary General to use his good offices to help find a durable political solution to the situation in Ukraine. South Africa welcomes the commencement of talks between Ukraine and Russia. We hope that this dialogue will lead to a diplomatic solution that will result in a lasting political solution. We urge all parties to approach the situation in a spirit of compromise, with all sides upholding human rights, abiding by their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra San Marino.
Mr. President, the Republic of San Marino is profoundly touched by the events in Ukraine and is following recent development with the utmost concern. Just a few days ago, a war in Europe in the 21st century simply did not seem possible, but it's actually happening now as we speak. The consequences are dire. As every war does, this conflict is causing harm to innocent civilians, resulting in the loss of human life and senseless suffering, as well as systematic serious violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. History teaches us that the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter shall never be forgotten and that we truly must live up to them. It is the primary responsibility of states to promote, respect and protect human rights. Therefore, San Marino calls on the parties to immediately stop this conflict and reiterate its support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity and independence of Ukraine within internationally recognized borders. We call on the party to return to dialogue and to work for a negotiated solution to avoid further suffering and violation of human rights. San Marino firmly stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Our government is currently putting in place national humanitarian initiatives to welcome refugees. Thank you for your attention.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra UNICEF. Tiene la palabra Perú.
Señor presidente, señora alta comisionada, el Perú condena la ofensiva militar de Rusia contra Ucrania que viola su integridad territorial y su soberanía nacional y contraviene el derecho internacional. Demandamos el cese inmediato de hostilidades. Expresamos nuestra profunda preocupación por el impacto del conflicto en la población civil y el deterioro de la situación humanitaria. Cada día que pasa y se prolonga el conflicto, la cifra de víctimas aumenta y lamentamos la trágica pérdida de vidas, especialmente de niñas y niños. Expresamos nuestra solidaridad con el más de medio millón de personas que se han visto obligados a huir de sus hogares, principalmente la población más vulnerable, en muchos casos dejando atrás a sus seres queridos, generando una crisis de desplazados internos y de refugiados. Demandamos el estricto respeto del derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, que se tomen las medidas necesarias para proteger a la población civil y que se garantice el acceso a la ayuda humanitaria para la población más necesitada. Exhortamos a que se inicien consultas y negociaciones para una solución diplomática, pacífica y negociada, en cumplimiento con los principios y obligaciones contenidas en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Jamaica.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this urgent debate. Jamaica aligns itself with the statement delivered by Barbados on behalf of the CARICOM member states. Jamaica strongly condemns the military incursion by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Mr. President, this unjustifiable act of aggression by the Russian Federation against its neighbor, a clear violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, is already having serious social, economic, and environmental effects. We lament the needless loss of lives and the continued disruption in the lives and livelihoods of thousands in Ukraine. We are alarmed at the deteriorating humanitarian situation, its impact on all persons, in particular women, children, and other vulnerable persons, as well as neighboring countries. Already thousands of persons have been displaced or have become refugees, and their ability to exercise their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights remain threatened. Jamaica urges the safe and orderly passage of all persons seeking to leave Ukraine for refuge, and we thank neighboring countries for their support in that regard. We reiterate the call for the immediate and complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine and the cessation of any further action that may intensify the current crisis in that country. Jamaica calls on Russia as a member of the Human Rights Council to act in a manner consistent with its duty to protect and promote the human rights of all persons. The continued use of force by Russia represents an abdication of this duty. This egregious act comes within the context of a world now seeking to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, during which the global community, including Russia, demonstrated a willingness to collaborate with a view to safeguarding lives. Years of progress towards the achievement of agreed international goals are at risk. We therefore reiterate the urgent call for a return to diplomatic channels and respect for the rights of a sovereign nation and its territorial integrity. Thank you, Chair.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Bangladesh.
Mr. President, Bangladesh expresses grave concern at the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We are deeply concerned at the sufferings and loss of lives of the innocent civilians. We urge the parties to ensure access for safe delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in need and safe passage to the civilians, including foreign nationals fleeing conflict in Ukraine. A Bangladeshi national was tragically killed yesterday due to a missile attack at a ship stranded in the Port Olivia in Ukraine. We express deep condolences to his families and near ones. Our government is trying to evacuate the rest of the crew of the ship, and we seek cooperation from all parties for their safe evacuation. Mr. President, Bangladesh calls for immediate cessation of the ongoing military operations in the Ukrainian territory. We believe that the obligations stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations regarding prohibition of use of force, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and peaceful settlement of international disputes must be complied with in all circumstances without exception. We therefore call on all parties to resume diplomacy and dialogue in order to settle the disputes by peaceful means and refrain from taking actions that may endanger international peace and security. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Mr. President, Bosnia and Herzegovina joins the European Union in condemning in the strongest terms the unprovoked war of aggression unleashed by Russia against the peaceful, independent and sovereign Ukraine, thereby undermining the humanitarian international law, as well as peace and security in Europe. Bosnia and Herzegovina fully supports the International Criminal Court prosecutor's decision to launch the investigation into possible war crimes or crimes against humanity in Ukraine. We call upon Russia to immediately cease its hostilities, unconditionally withdraw all forces from the territory of Ukraine, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence within its international recognized borders and territorial waters. We deplore the tragic loss of life and human suffering in Ukraine. The rights of vulnerable groups such as the women, children and the elderly must be upheld at all times. We extend our fullest support for independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also call on the urgent establishment of humanitarian corridor so that the medical supplies, food and hygiene products can safely reach those in need. We do appreciate the efforts of the High Commissioner and her office to protect and promote the universal rights and freedoms in Ukraine and the world at large in these extremely trying times. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tem a palavra a delegação do Cabo Verde.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Merci, Monsieur le Président. La délégation de Cap-Vert s'associe à la déclaration du groupe africain. Cap-Vert suit avec une grande attention et beaucoup de préoccupation le conflit armé en Ukraine. Aucun pays n'est indifférent à ce qui se passe en Ukraine, car nous sommes confrontés à un moment inattendu, éclipsé par les opérations militaires en cours qui laisseront des conséquences dramatiques dans le monde entier. Cette situation porte atteinte aux principes fondamentaux du droit international sur les relations pacifiques et les règlements de conflits entre les États. Nous appelons tous les partis en conflit à reprendre le chemin du dialogue, car c'est le meilleur moyen de défendre les droits de chacun. Cabo Verde est particulièrement préoccupé par la situation de la population ukrainienne, y compris les citoyens africains qui y vivent, dont les droits sont bafoués par ce conflit armé. Nous appelons à ce que les droits de toutes les personnes dans le pays soient protégés dans cette situation. Nous exhortons les parties en conflit à recourir au dialogue par la voie diplomatique pour résoudre les différends existants tout en respectant la souveraineté et l'intégrité de l'Ukraine et de préférence sous les auspices des Nations Unies. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Y el último orador de la lista es UNICEF, que volvió a la sala. UNICEF.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. President. The situation for children caught up in the conflict in Ukraine grows worse by the minute. We are receiving reports of hospitals, schools, water and sanitation facilities, and orphanages under fire. Explosive weapons in populated areas and explosive remnants of war are real and present dangers for the children of Ukraine. Children have been killed, children have been wounded, and children are being profoundly traumatized by the violence all around them. We appeal for a suspension of ongoing military actions in Ukraine. Such a suspension would allow for humanitarian help to reach people cut off after a week of intense airstrikes and fierce ground fighting nationwide. It would also allow families in the worst affected areas to venture out to get food and water, to seek medical care, and to live in search of safety. We renew our call on all parties to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure and to abide by all legal and moral obligations to keep children out of the line of fire. We must protect all children in Ukraine. Now, they need peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Hemos terminado la lista de oradores por el día de hoy. Mañana comenzaremos a las 10 de la mañana en la sala 20 y vamos a comenzar con la lista de oradores de instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos y organizaciones no gubernamentales. Quiero agradecer especialmente a los intérpretes por la gentileza y la generosidad y a la Secretaría que ha trabajado incansablemente desde el día lunes para acomodar una sesión particularmente compleja, híbrida, con muchos cambios en las listas y han sido muy eficientes y muy pacientes, y lo mismo que las delegaciones. Muchas gracias. Nos vemos mañana, 10 de la mañana, en la sala 20 y doy por concluida la 9ª reunión del 49º periodo de sesiones del Consejo.